Good day, everybody who is listening to this presentation. My name is Alla Kolesnik and I am presenting to you today Indian Act of Canada from 1876. The key concept of this presentation would be History of Indian Act. Also, I will be discussing the facts about the Indian Act that largely unknown and impact of this act on indigenous population of Canada. So the Indian Act came into power in 1876. It did not include Métis and Inuit population. This document consolidates numerous previous federal documents. This act was to assimilate indigenous population into Euro-Canadian culture. This act was changed many times, as I will be discussing later. However, the act has historic and ongoing impact on indigenous population, culture, politics, and communities. It caused intergenerational trauma, especially with residential schools. The picture here represents the look of the Indian Act. As I said, in 1876, Canadian government enacted an act consolidating the laws respecting Indians. There were earlier acts dealing with First Nations. Primary goal was to encourage assimilation. Let's discuss what some principles of the act were and how these principles affected indigenous peoples. Definition: who is and who is not Indian was particularly included. Particularly was for the status of men. Regarding status of Indian women, they could not have status if married non-Indian men, but Indian men could marry any woman. Indian women would lose the right to live on a reserve and their children could not have Indian status. This law put women into second group after the men, just like in white society. Women played a large role in Indian life, the life of matriarchy. This was against indigenous law of life and ruined all previous life of centuries. Also, reserves were created. The people needed to be living somewhere till assimilated. So there is bands and reserves in Canada. In USA, it's tribes and reservations. But they are not the same because indigenous people did not own land in Canada. The reserve land is in trust of the crown or a government and only be sold by the crown. In other words, indigenous peoples lost all rights to their land. At the same time, residential schools were created to assimilate children into white society. This event lasted till the 1996, when last residential school was closed in Saskatchewan. Reconciliation is a movement to talk about and to heal from the intergenerational trauma created by residential schools and much death that happened in those schools. Residential schools were church and government establishments where indigenous children were taken away from the family by force. Also, law was to rename individuals with European names. So-called Indian agent used to come to people and give the white names in order to assimilate and have population under control. People were not able to leave reserves without permission from Indian agent. If one would live for more than 30 days, that one could lose their Indian status. All lasted long into 20th century. During World War II, men would go to war and came back with no place to live. When asked why would they go to war, indigenous men say, "We have treaty obligation. Canada has obligations as well, so we will leave Canada." And we still wait for this to happen. They show incredible loyalty, of indigenous men and their belief in good government to bring, but they were taken advantage of. Another trauma. Another thing, one would lose the status who was admitted to university. The reason was the one whom be better than others, so one already assimilated into white society. This is my understanding, is representation against higher education by indigenous men and just another way to separate family and kill culture. Give away land to municipality. What does it mean? It means if municipality would need to build a road, then indigenous peoples have to move away. A lot of reserves were taken away from people. It was said to give other people the land to cultivate crops because indigenous people were no good and had to move. Forbidden to form political organizations. If more than 3 people get together, then it was illegal and was observed by Indian agents, federal employee. Prohibited to solicit money in response to indigenous claims. So if someone would seek money, they were not allowed to go to court. Just another law that lowered status of indigenous peoples. Prohibited to sell alcohol, ammunition. Why? Because indigenous people were considered savages and dangerous, and so they could not protect themselves. This had another effect. Without ammunition, people could not hunt, which was and is one of the ways people use to live from the land. Indigenous people had their governing bodies, but to disseminate the culture and separate, the federal government had to have electing chiefs for only a year or so and then change. And they would be accountable to Indian Affairs Office. Forbidden to speak language, participate in traditional religion, forbidden to wear traditional regalia in shows and such. Aggressively taken away culture and thought process. Here is a picture of Algonquin couple in 18th century. Picture of Algonquin man, 19th century. Algonquin people live in Ontario. Algonquin men in present day. In museums, we see all sorts of indigenous people regalia. Usually, that was collected, but it was not collected. It was taken and confiscated in 1920s. Museums now returning the things to indigenous peoples. Forbidden to participate in such an important ceremony as potlatch ceremony. Potlatch involves giving away or destroying wealth or valuable items. Potlatch ceremonies were also used in coming-of-age rituals. When children were born, they would be given their first name at the time of their birth, which was usually associated with the location of the birthplace. About a year later, the child's family would hold a potlatch and give gifts to the guests in attendance on behalf of the child. During that potlatch, the family would give the child their second name. Once the child reached about 12 years of age, they were expected to have a potlatch of their own, but giving out small gifts that they had collected their family and people, at which point they would be able to receive their third name. We see here what is called a speaker figure. A person would stand behind this figurine and invite the guests. We see as well a picture of potlatch ceremony, which was a big occasion in life of indigenous peoples. This important event was also taken away by Indian Act. Now we're in 1884, 8 years past the Indian Act. In 1884, MacDonald and his government changed the Indian Act, making it illegal to encourage and participate in the potlatch ceremony. This prohibition in the Indian Act became known as Potlatch Law. So it was further prohibited. Not just don't participate, but also ask to participate was illegal. As we see, this was done to separate people even further. Here we see the beautiful building in British Columbia where ceremonies of potlatch are taking place now. We are almost 100 years later in 1951. In 1951, restrictions were lifted on the prohibition of ceremonies like the potlatch and Sundance. Indigenous peoples can have assembly. Another change required that the register of all status Indians be maintained and band listed were to be posted. We see here a Sundance ceremony. What is it? Members of otherwise independent bands gathered to reaffirm beliefs about the world and the supernatural through rituals of personal and community sacrifice. Typically, young men would dance semi-continuously for several days and nights without eating or drinking. Today, many indigenous bands still hold Sundance ceremonies, many of which are open to the public as a means of educating about the culture. If you get the opportunity to attend one of the as a spectator, there are a few things to keep in mind. First, remember that it is a sacred ritual with rich and complex cultural history. Spectators are encouraged to watch respectfully and even ask thoughtful questions afterwards, but should never join in. 1969, the Canadian government led by Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau and Minister of Indian Affairs Jean Chrétien, yes, Jean Chrétien, the one that became a Prime Minister later, proposed a policy paper known as White Paper, what aimed to abolish the Indian Act and assimilated Indigenous peoples into mainstream Canadian society, a proposal that was met with strong opposition from Indigenous leaders. White Paper, officially titled the Statement of the Government of Canada on Indian Policy. As a response to the White Paper, Indigenous leaders drafted a Red Paper, also known as Citizens Plus, which advocated for a reform of the Indian Act rather than its abolition and proposed a number of other suggestions. In 1885, there are significant changes in the Indian Act when Parliament passed Bill C-31, an act to amend the Indian Act. Bill C-61 brought the Act into line with the provisions of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The three principles that guided the amendment of the Indian Act were removing discrimination, restoring status and membership rights, increasing control of Indian bands over their own affairs. And now we are in 21st century. In 2002, change to allow band members leave of reserves, but able to vote in band elections. In 2011, change to able grandchildren of women who lost status became entitled to registration for Indian status. It took over a century. 2013, Métis and non-status Indians are included in responsibility for Indians. 2016, changes in Jobs and Growth Act included education, financial administration, accommodating in disabilities. 2017, gender-based inequality addressed. It was added prohibited to discriminate gender identity. Since the 1990s, several pieces of legislation have been proposed allowing indigenous bands to opt out of a participation in the Indian Act if an agreement is signed between the band and the government. These are called sectoral legislative arrangements. One of them is the First Nations Land Management. Another one, First Nations Fiscal Management Act. Another one, First Nations Oil and Gas and Money Management Act. This one is very important, allowing bands to assume management of oil and gas resources on their reserves. Another one, First Nations Commercial and Industrial Development Act. So the bands have a registry for reserve real estate. Now, what organization is supporting indigenous people in Canada? The organization is called AFN, Assembly of the First Nations. Advocate to the rights and quality of life of First Nations people in Canada. AFN advocates for First Nations in Canada, facilitating regional discussions and dialogue, advocacy efforts and campaigns, legal and political analysis, and building relationships between First Nations, governments, businesses, and the general public. I would like to share some statistics here. Indigenous people in Canada and in Ontario. As we can see, there are almost 2 million Indigenous population in Canada, which is 400,000 living in Ontario. First Nations single identity is 1,250,000 people live in Ontario. Métis is living in Ontario, 100,000, 34,000 living in Ontario. Inuit is 4,000 people. And there is a reference page. But I would like to end my presentation with this beautiful picture of Indigenous painter Betty Albert called The Morning Blessing. Betty Albert was adopted and raised by French-Canadian parents in northern Ontario. Circumstances eventually brought her back to her Native American father, discovering her birthday as a Cree. The Cree are a North American Indigenous people. They are one of the largest group of First Nations in Canada, with over 350,000 people having Cree ancestry. Their language is one of the most widely used indigenous languages. Cree First Nations occupy territory of subarctic region from Alberta to Quebec, as well as portions of the Plains region in Alberta and Saskatchewan. On the picture, mother, daughter, and a baby watching a sunrise. For me, it represents bring future of indigenous peoples' rebirth, of the hope for the peace and prosperity. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.